In 1941, Germany decides to invade the Soviet Union. Basically, after conquering most of Europe, Germany turns its focus east, trying to crush the Soviet Union. They push deep into Russian land, going after key cities like Moscow and Leningrad. At first, things seem to be going really well for the Germans. They're making huge progress and taking over a lot of territory. But then, as they keep going further into Russia, problems start popping up. The Soviet Union is really struggling. Even though they're not directly involved in the fighting, the US starts sending massive amounts of aid to the Soviets through Lend-Lease. It's everything: food, weapons, tanks, planes, trucks, basically anything the Soviets need to keep fighting. The US is helping like crazy, and it makes a huge difference. This support gives what the Soviet Union needs, allowing them to push back the Germans. Then, the US gets attacked at Pearl Harbor, so they get dragged into the war. But instead of going after Japan first, the US decides to focus on defeating Germany. With the other Allied powers, the Americans land on German-controlled France. The Germans would slowly crumble by both the Soviets and Americans until they would eventually surrender. After the USA would drop 2 nukes on Japan, World War II would be over. The 2 superpowers would agree to cut Europe in half. The West would have Western Europe and the Soviets would have Eastern Europe. For the first few months, everything was going great. In the East, the Soviets would create the Warsaw Pact. The alliance contained most of Eastern Europe, including Yugoslavia, as an observer state. The pact completely threw off the world. America was not a fan of it, so they held a meeting with the rest of the European powers in Washington, D.C. But sadly, the meeting didn't go as expected. Many major powers couldn't come to an agreement of what they should do to retaliate. The Americans really pushed the idea of a counter-alliance, but the French rejected it. Without a major power like France, the idea of NATO was thrown into the garbage. Unknown to many, the Cold War had already begun. Both the US and the Soviet Union were sending spies to each other's soil like crazy. Soviet spies in DC would uncover the meeting that took place about the possibility of NATO. And luckily for them, they now knew that there would be no counter-alliance against them. The Warsaw Pact took this opportunity to push around some weaker countries. In Greece, communism and monarchism were 2 popular ideologies, but those 2 sides couldn't get along very well. Civil war was right around the corner for Greece. So, with the West dealing with their own troubles, the Soviets would intervene in Greek instability and would start a real civil war. Bulgaria and Albania would directly invade. Meanwhile, the Soviets would send big amounts of aid to the communist side. The Americans would call an emergency UN meeting, but Greece would fall in only 3 weeks. Greece would immediately be made an observer state to the Warsaw Pact after the communists would win the Civil War. Because the Soviets now knew there would be no NATO in the near future, they were way more aggressive and cocky than usual. In North Africa, some of the only free nations in Africa were getting heated. Egypt and Libya were both released as independent nations in the World War II treaty. Both of these countries did not like each other. Matter of fact, they hated each other. And in this day and age, the way to settle it was war. The Soviets secretly aided Libya with weapons and military vehicles, and even a few tanks. But most importantly, they supported them with hundreds of airplanes. And only a few days later, after the planes would arrive on Libyan soil, Egypt would get invaded. Even though the beef between these 2 was known, the world and Egypt were both taken by surprise. With complete air superiority, the Libyans would be able to bomb any spots where the Egyptian military was defending. Air raids would also be ordered on both Cairo and Alexandria, hurting the population. The Libyan army would burst into Egypt and would quickly invade up to Alexandria, where a bloodshed battle would happen. The Libyans would do an encirclement movement and would eventually capture 35,000 Egyptian soldiers in the city. This was no small number for the newly independent Egypt. In fact, this was the worst thing that could have happened to them. British aid was starting to come in from Sudan, which gave the Egyptian army some sweet guns and equipment. But it didn't include vehicles, or more importantly, planes, to combat the bombing, so it was kind of worthless. Libya would just keep on pushing east until they would make a decision, either go to Cairo or go to the Suez. After the Libyan army would barge into the canal and take control of most of it, international pressure would immediately mount on Egypt. Countries from all around the world pressured Egypt to just surrender, so the canal can get back to business. Egypt didn't really have a choice anymore, so they would agree to whatever terms the Libyans would give them. The treaty would make Egypt's government do a 180 and turn socialist. Libya would get a very small amount of land, and the canal would be given to the Soviets, which would become very controversial. Literally, just a few days after Egypt would surrender, just a little to the west, Algeria would suddenly get tired of the French controlling them. So the right thing to do was aggressively revolt. Hundreds of French soldiers who were just stationed in Algeria would get murdered by the Algerian rebellion. Obviously, the French could not just let that happen, so they would immediately send reinforcements to crush this rebellion. But here's where things get tricky. Libyan and Soviet weapons and vehicles would soon be spotted all over the Algerians, meaning the communists were supporting this unrest. Back in mainland France, there was a real political fight over whether the country should stay democratic or try out socialism and align more with the Soviet Union. So once the popular socialist movement found out that the communists were supporting Algeria, they would follow the same road. Now, France was missing a big chunk of support from their civilians and politicians, and because of that, France would sit down with Algeria and would settle the peace terms as quickly as the rebellion came. And Algeria was pretty damn greedy, so they would get a good amount of land from France. But after some quick infighting, socialist Algeria and socialist Tunis would come out on top from the war, quickly aligning with the Soviets. Almost 1 year later, after the North African Wars, North Korea would get the okay from the Soviets to launch their invasion of South Korea. But they also got an okay from someone else, and that was China. China would agree to help the invasion with 500,000 soldiers. Seoul would get taken in just a few days, and the advance was only getting quicker. The US and other countries would immediately create a united force to help South Korea. But in only 2.5 weeks, South Korea would fall, just too late for the others to arrive to help. And just like that, the Korean War would be physically over, but not mentally. North Korea would transform into just Korea and would crack down on everybody in former South Korea, making sure they knew that things would be different under this government. Meanwhile, in China, Chinese and Soviet relations would skyrocket like never before after the war, both hating America and loving communism. This was a huge threat to America and the West. But wait, there's more. In Iran, Soviet-funded rebel groups would finally explode and start rising up all over Iran. In Tehran, the bloodiest battles would occur, with over 20,000 casualties happening in only one day. The Iranian Republic would try desperately to hold on to their power, but the rebellions would just be too strong. Soon enough, there would be dozens of different rebellion and terror groups popping up in the country, most of them being funded by the Soviets just to cause more chaos. The USSR would declare that the civil war near their southern border was a huge danger to their people, demanding that the war would stop within 2 weeks, or else they would have to get involved. And once that time frame flew by, the Soviets would invade Iran. Most of the rebellion groups would side with the Soviets, and for those who didn't, they were already super weak. Iran would be replaced with the Democratic People's Republic of Iran, which just means a communist Iran. And also, to a lot of people's surprise, the Warsaw Pact would accept Iran as an observer state, clearly expanding outside of Europe. Greece and Yugoslavia would become full member states as well. 2 years later, after no big events, the four main powers of the world would meet in Paris. The discussion was about Austria. The country was still split into 4 sections, each occupied by one of these 4 countries. And for whatever reason, they hadn't been reunified, unlike Germany a few years back. So the 4 powers would agree to unify the country into a neutral Austria. But after only 3 weeks of this new country, the Soviets would tell the communist Austrians, who were secretly still in their occupied portion, to revolt and coup the country. And since Austria was neutral towards everybody, the West didn't really help Austria, and even if they could, it would happen too fast. Austria would immediately become another member state of the Warsaw Pact. In that same year, on the other side of the world, Laos and Cambodia would get heated after a small skirmish on the border that would leave 2 soldiers dead. The US and Soviet Union immediately got in on this and would pick their sides to support. But here's the problem. The Soviets would easily provide aid and support for Laos through their border with China. Meanwhile, the Americans had to ship their support all the way from across the earth. The plan for the communists was to attack now or never, because the Cambodians hadn't received their aid from the US since it was taking some time to be shipped. Laos, with military equipment and tanks from the Soviet Union, would easily invade all of Cambodia. For the peace treaty, Cambodia would become a socialist nation, just like Laos, and would cut off all ties with America. Just a few inches to the west, Myanmar would fall into a deadly civil war. The Chinese government would do the same thing the USSR did in Iran and would get involved in the war. Chinese numbers would simply overwhelm the country that was already fighting itself. After a quick and sudden invasion, Myanmar would become the People's Republic of Burma, a puppet for the Chinese. Burma would become a very significant player in the Cold War later. And again, just a little to the west, Bangladesh would become the next target for communism. Bangladesh was currently controlled by Pakistan, and the people didn't really like that anymore. A movement named the People's Bangladeshi Liberation Front would surge in popularity and would eventually demand that they become independent from Pakistan. Pakistan would immediately deny their demands, and a new civil war would begin just a month after Burma's. Pakistan would underestimate Bangladesh's strength by miles. Bangladesh would easily take control of their land, and now Pakistan would have no choice but to allow them independence. At this point, the US was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Communism had just expanded in 4 different countries around the world in under a year. This wasn't good. And sadly for them, it was about to get a lot worse. In Cuba, an unexpected coup would baffle the world. A Soviet-supported government would take control of Cuba, cutting all ties with America and the West. Cuba was always very friendly towards the US, but now this? Well, this was just not okay. Many Western countries would condemn the actions of the new Cuban government, but nobody would actually do anything about it. And that's because focus would go elsewhere. In Turkey, the Soviets would decide they wanted to show some strength. They would send their Black Sea Fleet to the Istanbul Canal after some disagreements with Turkey. After the Cuban coup, Turkey would not allow the Soviets to ship anything else besides normal trade stuff in and out of their canal, meaning the Soviets couldn't send military aid anymore. The Soviet fleet would just stand there in front of the canal, not really doing much besides showing power. Soon, the US would be alerted about it and would send their fleet. For a moment, it would be an awkward standoff, but soon, the Soviets would just retreat after realizing they can't do anything. In Mongolia, although they were already pretty aligned with the communists, the Soviets would still make sure to support a coup in their country. The coup would secretly be to make the Mongols more Soviet-aligned rather than Chinese-aligned. After a messy coup that would take the lives of around 1,000, Mongolia would be offered to join the Warsaw Pact, which they would very quickly join. Meanwhile, we're talking about all this diplomacy stuff. Technology is rapidly advancing in both the West and East. The Soviets would be the first ones to launch a rocket into space, crippling morale in the West in terms of the space race. In 1963, the first African Revolution would take place. Some would be peaceful and others would be the exact opposite. But in the end, 5 countries would declare independence: Kenya, Angola, Zaire, Rwanda, and Mozambique. Many European leaders would start to worry, knowing it will be harder to survive without their colonies. In Arabia, the first Mecca meeting would take place. New borders would be drawn between the attending nations. The topic of America versus Soviets was also being talked about. Most nations seemed to take the side of the Soviets, since they had the same enemies. Now here's a big event. In East Germany, nations all across the Warsaw Pact would send their militaries. And in 1965, they would conduct a surprise invasion into West Germany. Berlin would quickly be taken meanwhile, an all-out invasion would go deep into West Germany. Austria and Czechoslovakia would invade from their borders with Germany. Hamburg would be lost in a week. Munich would be the next to go. West Germany was simply not prepared for such a crazy invasion. West Germany would capitulate. East Germany would annex everything. Back to Cuba, an American spy plane would see Soviet missiles on the island. Now, this was a huge threat. Soviet missiles wouldn't be able to reach mainland America before, but now with their missiles literally on their doorstep, the Soviets could easily blow up any American city. The president at the time, Lyndon B. Johnson, would immediately get everything ready. Documents of the current crisis would be leaked to the public, causing chaos all around the country. Lyndon would call up Stalin to figure out what was going on, but he wouldn't be able to connect. After a few extremely scary days, they would finally speak, and after some complicated business, it would go something like this. The Soviet Union would take their missiles out of Cuba. and the United States would take their missiles out of Turkey. Speaking of Turkey, as soon as the United States would get their missiles and everything else out of the country, the Warsaw Pact would do a surprise invasion against Turkey. The Soviet fleet would arrive back at the canal to land troops. Meanwhile, Greece and Iran would push into their fronts. Kurdish and Armenian rebels would spark up after being funded by the Soviets. America would be furious after realizing the Soviets tricked them into pulling their weapons out of Turkey. But either way, they still didn't want full-out war, especially since Cuba's missiles hadn't been fully exported. Turkey's defense would be able to hold for a little while, in some fronts, but there was no possible way to hold on to everything. Turkey would capitulate to the Warsaw Pact after 2 months of war. The Warsaw Pact's quick wars was something the world has never seen before. One after the other, Europe was being stripped of Western powers. The US demanded that NATO would be formed, whether other nations like it or not. NATO would be formed on December 1965. 11 nations would join the alliance. The Warsaw Pact would condemn the alliance, but they all knew it would happen one day. In China, they had been preparing this for years. A swift naval blockade would surround Taiwan. Naval battles would occur all over the Taiwanese coasts. Taiwan Navy was strong, but not strong enough. China would land on multiple cities on the west coast. Taiwanese defenses were not ready. They had only migrated to that island 2 decades ago. They were not fully fortified. China would invade and annex the whole island, finally destroying one of their worst enemies. Now here's another big event. If you remember, communism had been on the rise in France, especially after Algeria declared their independence. Socialism has basically become more popular than the normal democracy that is the current government of France. The Soviet Union obviously couldn't let an opportunity like this go. Since France wasn't in NATO and actually isn't really friendly with the West recently, it was very unlikely the British or Americans would come to their support directly. The Warsaw Pact would sponsor a coup in Paris and other big cities, needing a big takeover. The pact would also begin a direct invasion, invading from Germany. Multiple colonies in the world would declare independence during this time, taking their opportunities. The French military was heavily split and in most cases would side with the communists, meaning France would have no chance. France would surrender, a new commune of France taking over, joining the Warsaw Pact. Hold up, wait a minute before we continue. I need you to subscribe. I mean, look at this. Only 2% of you are subscribed. Come on, if you like my videos, please hit that subscribe button, the like button, drop a comment, and join the Discord. I upload not that often, so come on, do it. Okay, by now the video is going to get too long if I keep up this pace, so I'm going to speed run these next events until we get to Vietnam. In Finland, a long-awaited invasion would begin. The Finnish would defend furiously against the invasion, but ultimately would be pushed back all the way to Helsinki, forcing them to surrender and become communist. In Afghanistan, a joint Soviet-Persian invasion would come out of nowhere. The mountainous terrain would make it easy for the Afghans to defend, but either way, they wouldn't be able to survive forever against a superpower. In India, Pakistan would attack their land in Kashmir, commencing the First Kashmir War. Pakistan would receive aid by the Soviets. Meanwhile, the Indians would receive aid from the Americans. In the end, it would end with a white peace. The Second African Revolution would start and end with over 20 new countries gaining their independence. The French and British would be the most affected, luckily for everybody. Most of these countries would gain their independence peacefully, but not everybody. Zaire and the Congo would fight after disagreements to become a union. The Soviets would support the Congo and the Americans would support Zaire, but interestingly, the superpowers would switch sides as the situation would develop. Ultimately, Zaire would annex the Congo. In Spain, Catalonia and Andalusia would peacefully declare their independence. Both would immediately join the Warsaw Pact, basically forcing the Spanish to join NATO. Ethiopia, with the support of the British, would invade Somalia. Both the Soviets and Saudi Arabians would support Somalia. In the end, Ethiopia would surrender and would be forced to release Eritrea as an independent nation. In South America, Chile would undergo a communist coup, supported mainly by the Chinese. Bolivia would invade Paraguay basically out of nowhere. America would send aid to Paraguay. And out of spite, Bolivia would become socialist and Soviet-aligned. In the end, Bolivia would win. Nigeria would also undergo a communist coup this time, more Soviet and French supported. Then, Nigeria would be invaded by American and British-supported Cameroon and Niger. Nigeria would easily repel the attack and would take land from both nations, even gaining a puppet in the north. The Second Kashmir War would start with Pakistan and China invading India in a surprise attack. In the end, India would give up some land in the north. The First Gulf War would begin once Iraq would invade Kuwait. A combination of over 20 countries would invade Iraq. The Soviets would support Iraq but would suffer their first big defeat. Iraq would be turned into a U.S. puppet. The Second Mecca meeting would begin with these attending nations. New borders would be drawn in the Middle East. The Soviet Union would heavily influence this meeting. Soviet-supported Bolivia would invade American and Brazilian-supported Peru. Bolivia needed a coastline, even if their ally Chile was helping them. Bolivia would have a coastline after the peace treaty. The Warsaw Pact's name is kinda outdated, so the Soviet Union would announce a change in the name. It is now known as quote-unquote the Moscow Pact. Now, the time I bet a lot of you have been waiting for. In this universe, the Vietnam War wouldn't last as long as you'd think. The war starts the same way America would send military reinforcements to South Vietnam, their goal being to unite Vietnam under democracy. Meanwhile, the Soviets and Chinese would send their military with the same goal in mind, just with communism instead. At first, South Vietnam would have pretty good success in invading upwards, but soon they would be stopped by North Vietnam defenses. Laos and Cambodia, both Soviet-aligned nations because of earlier, would allow North Vietnam to use their land to invade South Vietnam. From there, a whole new aspect would rise. South Vietnam would be forced to declare war on Cambodia and Laos, which would be seen as an unnecessary escalation by the rest of the world, stopping possible allies from joining the war on their side. Back home, public opinion on this war was in the negative numbers. Nobody was in support of this anymore. The US had no choice but to bring back their men and let Vietnam be taken by the communists, sealing their dominance in Southeast Asia. So far, this was probably the worst morale killer in the Cold War yet for America.